Get this thing out of my seat.
$300.
What?
I'm not going anywhere. I want it done right here, where everybody can see.
Get this thing out of my seat. Carolyn Ashford's voice cut through the first-class cabin of Pinnacle Airways, Flight 1083, like a blade dragged across glass. And before a single passenger could process what they had just heard, she reached down past the 9-year-old girl in 2B, grabbed the small purple backpack from under the seat in front of 2A by its worn fabric strap, and hurled it into the aisle with such casual, practiced force that it skidded across the carpet, bounced once off the beverage cart rail and slammed into the galley wall with a sound that made every head in the forward cabin turn at once. The zipper burst on impact, and a small yellow notebook and a plastic horse came skittering out across the floor like things that had been shaken loose from a life. 9-year-old Maya Holloway made a sound. Not a cry, not a scream, just a sound. The kind that comes from a place so deep inside a child that it doesn't have a name yet. And the entire first-class cabin of that airplane heard it, and not one of them would ever be able to describe it afterward without pausing. Her father didn't shout. He didn't stand up. He didn't grab the woman's arm or call for a manager or do any of the things that 14 passengers in that forward cabin were already preparing to watch him do. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, the brown one with the frayed cuff and the small burn hole near the elbow that he'd never gotten around to patching, and he pulled out a pen and a folded receipt, and in handwriting so steady it could have been written on a workbench. He wrote down 4 names. 5 minutes after that plane pushed back from the gate, it stopped. The engine spooled down. The jet bridge, which had already pulled away, groaned back into place. The cabin lights came up to full, and every single passenger in first class was ordered off the aircraft because of what that quiet man in the worn brown jacket actually was. The first thing James Holloway did that morning was check the tickets. He checked them in the kitchen with his coffee still too hot to drink, holding them up under the light above the stove and reading every line the way a man reads a letter from somebody who isn't coming back. He checked them again in the parking garage, and then a third time in the security line at O'Hare, tilting the boarding passes under the fluorescent lights, as if the ink might have changed its mind since the last time he looked. Dad. Maya tugged the sleeve of his jacket. You already looked. I know. 3 times. 4 if you count the kitchen. Why do you keep looking? James folded the boarding passes carefully and slid them into the inside pocket of his jacket, the brown corduroy one with the frayed cuff and the small burn hole near the left elbow from a soldering iron. He'd fumbled 2 winters ago and never bothered to repair because the jacket still worked and a new one could wait. And waiting was something James Holloway had gotten very, very good at over the past 11 months, because your mother used to say a man who checks twice never has to apologize once. Maya thought about the way 9-year-olds think about things, which is to say seriously, and for about 4 seconds, and with the absolute conviction that adults are mostly making things up as they go along and just hoping nobody notices. That doesn't explain 4 times, she said. No, James admitted. It doesn't. She grinned at him, and he felt the whole 9 years of his life since her birth land on his shoulders, at once heavy and good, the weight of a thing you'd carry forever, and never once set down willingly. The truth was simpler than anything he could have said out loud in a security line at 6:40 in the morning with a TSA agent watching. Those 2 boarding passes represented 11 months of overtime, 11 months of Saturdays under a Cessna's cowling at the shop in Rockford, with grease ground so deep into the creases of his knuckles that it had become a kind of permanent tattoo, a record of labor written directly into his skin. 11 months of packing his own lunch in a dented metal box, instead of buying a sandwich from the truck that came by at noon, because the sandwich was $7, and $7.52 times was $364, and $364 was almost exactly the seat lock fee for 2 first-class tickets on Pinnacle Airways, Flight 1083 Chicago O'Hare to Charleston, South Carolina. 11 months of driving a truck with 214,000 miles on it because a new one could wait. 11 months of telling a 9-year-old, not this month, sweetheart, maybe next month, until she stopped asking, which was worse than anything the day she stopped asking, because it meant she'd learned something he never wanted to teach her, that wanting things cost something even before you got them. Seat 2A and Seat 2B. First class. The real seats, the wide ones, the ones with blankets that weren't made of recycled sandwich wrap, and screens that actually worked, and flight attendants who looked you in the eye when they talked to you instead of through you. Charleston, because that was where Angela was from. That was where her mother's house still stood on a quiet street, lined with live oaks, whose branches met above the road, like hands clasped in prayer. That was where a small white church held a small brass plaque with her name on it. Angela Marie Sutherland, Holloway, beloved daughter, beloved wife, beloved mother, and where Maya had never once set foot in her entire life. 2 years. 2 years since the phone call that came on a Wednesday afternoon while James was elbow deep in a Continental 0470 engine and had to wipe his hands on a rag before he could answer. 2 years since the hospital corridor with the buzzing light and the bad coffee and the doctor who came out of a room and didn't have to say anything at all because his face said every word. 2 years since the day James Holloway learned exactly how much a human being could carry before he had to sit down on the floor of a stairwell and put his head in his hands and stay there for a very long time. He'd promised himself 2 things that year, and he'd meant them both the way a man means the things he says to himself in a stairwell when nobody's watching. That Maya would never see him break, and that one day he'd take her home, not in the back of a bus, not in the last row of a red eye with her neck bent sideways against a window shade, but properly up front, where people got treated like people. Where she could sit in a wide seat and pull a real blanket up to her chin and look out at the clouds and know just for 52 minutes what it felt like to have the world arranged in her favor. Dad. Yeah, are we rich now? James laughed, a short, surprised bark of a sound that got a look from the TSA agent 2 lanes over and a delighted grin from Maya, who collected her father's rare laughs the way some kids collected coins. No, baby. We are not even a little bit rich. Then how come we're in the front? Because sometimes he said, crouching down to fix her jacket zipper, which had gone sideways again the way it always did because the jacket was from last winter, and she'd grown 2 inches since then, and he hadn't gotten around to replacing it, because replacing things cost money, and money was what he'd been spending on this. You spend a lot on one thing, so you can remember it forever. That's not rich. That's just choosing. Choosing what? Choosing a memory over a bunch of stuff. He stood up. Come on. Gate 12. Gate 12 was crowded and warm, and smelled like burnt coffee and carpet cleaner and the particular staleness of recycled airport air that always made James think of waiting rooms, which was essentially what airports were, just waiting rooms with better lighting and worse sandwiches. Maya wanted to sit by the windows and watch the ground crew, so James sat beside her and watched them too. And after a while, she noticed he was watching differently than she was. She was watching the way a kid watches, which is to say, with delight and curiosity, and the reasonable expectation that something interesting might happen at any moment. He was watching the way a man watches, who has spent his entire adult life around airplanes, and sees them not as machines, but as patients, each one with its own history, and its own temperament, and its own particular way of telling you something was wrong, if you knew how to listen. You're doing the thing, she said. What thing? The mechanic thing where you look at a plane like it's a person. It is a person, James said, tilting his head slightly toward the window. Every one of them's a little different. That one out, the one at gate 14. Listen, he paused. That's an auxiliary power unit that needs a bearing looked at. Hear that? That little whine underneath the hum, like somebody humming a note that's just a quarter tone flat. You can hear that from in here. I've heard about 4,000 of them. After a while, you don't listen for it. You just hear it the way you hear somebody call your name in a loud room. An older man, 2 seats down, lowered his newspaper. He had big hands and a silver crew cut and a ball cap that said USS Coral Sea, and his eyes had the particular sharpness of a man who had spent a lifetime paying attention to things that most people walked past without seeing. 22 years in the Navy, he said. Aviation machinist's mate. You're right about that, APU. That's a bearing on its way out. I'd give it another 100 hours, maybe 150 if somebody's been greasing it properly, which from the sound of it they haven't. James smiled. Whereabouts were you stationed? Pensacola mostly. Then everywhere else, which is the Navy's way of saying they owned me, and I went where they pointed. The man extended a hand. Big, scarred, the kind of hand that had held wrenches and soldering irons, and probably a few things considerably more dangerous. Earl Jenkins, James Holloway. This is my daughter Maya. Ma'am. Earl gave Maya a small, formal nod, the kind of nod a man gives when he has been raised to believe that courtesy is not a decoration, but a load-bearing wall, and Maya was so enormously delighted by being called Mom that she sat up 2 inches straighter and nearly knocked her juice box off the armrest. First flight, Earl asked. First one ever, Maya said, and the pride in her voice was so bright and so unguarded that it made James's chest hurt in the good way. We're in first class. Well now. Earl raised his eyebrows in a way that made it seem like the most impressive thing he'd heard in a year, and James could tell it wasn't performance. It was the genuine article a man who remembered what things meant when they were earned instead of expected. That's how it ought to be done. My dad saved up, Maya said, and James felt his ears go hot, and he didn't say anything because he'd learned a long time ago that correcting a proud child was a kind of theft, that when a kid is telling somebody the true story of what her father did for her, you don't interrupt to add context or qualifiers or any of the 10 different ways adults have invented to make a simple thing complicated. Earl looked at James then, just for a second. The look one working man gives another when he understands exactly what 11 months looks like, when he can see the shape of it in the other man's jacket, and his boots, and the careful way he holds the boarding passes, and the particular quietness of a man who has done something large and doesn't need anybody to tell him it was large, because he already knows, and the knowing is enough. Son, Earl said, enjoy every minute. They boarded first, which Maya found almost unbearably exciting. We go before everybody. We go before everybody. Dad, even the people already in line, even that man in the suit, even him, we go first. She walked down that jet bridge like a woman entering a ballroom, her chin up and her shoulders back, and her small purple backpack bouncing against her spine with every step. And James walked 3 paces behind her, with her boarding pass in one hand and his own duffel in the other. And he thought clearly, and without any particular drama, in the simple way that the most important thoughts arrive. This is the best morning of my life since the day she was born. The flight attendant at the aircraft door was young, maybe 26, with dark hair pulled back and a smile that arrived a half-second before her eyes did the way it does with people who've been trained to smile before they've had time to mean it. Her name tag said, Simone. Good morning. Boarding passes, James handed them over. Simone glanced down, and something in her face settled into the particular expression of a person who is doing her job correctly and knows it. 2A and 2B. Right this way, sir. Welcome aboard. Thank you. The cabin was quiet and cool and smelled like leather and the faint chemical ghost of whatever they used to clean it, and the seats were wide enough that Maya stopped dead in the aisle and stared at them with her mouth slightly open, which was the highest compliment a 9-year-old could pay to any piece of furniture. Dad, I know. They're huge. They are. Is that a real blanket? That's a real blanket. Can I keep it? No. Can I use it? You can absolutely use it. She slid into 2A, the window seat, and James stowed her purple backpack under the seat in front of her, exactly the way he'd explained to her twice how to do it herself, because that was what fathers did. They showed you, and then they did it for you anyway, and someday you do it yourself, and think of them. Then he sat down in 2B, and for about 90 seconds, everything in James Holloway's world was exactly correct. Maya pressed her forehead against the window. You can see the whole airport. You can. Is that our plane's wing? That's our wing. Is it? Strong? James leaned over and looked at it. A professional look, the kind he'd given 10,000 wings. The kind that saw not the polished surface, but the spar beneath it. The ribs, the rivets. The stress points the places where fatigue like to hide. That wing, he said, can hold up more than 3 times what it'll ever need to carry. It could take a beating you wouldn't believe and keep flying. How do you know? Because that's my job, sweetheart. I know what holds. Maya settled back into her seat, pulled the blanket up to her chin, even though it was 72 degrees in the cabin, and said in the smallest voice, she had the one she used for the things that mattered most. Mom would have liked this. James didn't answer right away. He couldn't. The words had landed in the center of his chest and sat there for a moment, warm and sharp, at the same time the way grief always was. Never one thing or the other, but always both. Yeah, finally. She would have liked this a lot. Carolyn Ashford came aboard 8 minutes later, and the temperature in the cabin changed. She did not walk. She advanced. There was a difference, and everyone in the forward cabin felt it the way you feel a weather front move through, not because anything visible has changed, but because the pressure has shifted, and your body knows it before your mind does. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled back so tightly, it looked less like a hairstyle and more like a decision severe and immaculate and calibrated to communicate that this was a woman who controlled things, all things, beginning with herself. Camel coat tailored so precisely, it might have been sewn onto her that morning. Heels that struck the floor of the jet bridge like punctuation each step, a period at the end of a sentence nobody else had been invited to read. A phone was at her ear, and 2 assistants trailed behind her, one carrying a garment bag, and the other, a younger man named Patrick, carrying nothing at all except a tablet and an expression of permanent apology. The look of a person whose entire professional existence consisted of absorbing the overflow of someone else's intensity. No, tell him the number is the number. If Warfield wants to renegotiate, he can renegotiate with somebody else's capital. A pause. She listened the way predators listen, not for content but for weakness. I don't care what his attorney says. I've bought and sold 4 companies out from under men who talked exactly like that. Another pause, shorter this time. Her patience had an expiration date, and it was approaching fast. Because they hesitate, Patrick. They always hesitate. And the moment they do, they've already lost, they just haven't done the math yet. She ended the call without saying goodbye, the way people end calls when goodbye is a courtesy they've decided they can no longer afford. And she looked up for the first time since boarding, and she stopped. Her eyes went to row 2, to the window seat, to the 9-year-old girl under the blanket with her forehead still pressed against the window, and then to the man sitting beside her, the black man in the brown corduroy jacket, with the frayed cuff and the burn hole near the elbow. And something moved across Carolyn Ashford's face that was not anger, not yet, something colder and quicker and far more practiced the expression of a woman performing a calculation. She had performed 10,000 times before the instant arithmetic of who matters and who doesn't, who is a factor and who is furniture, who will push back and who will fold. "Simone," she said without turning around. The flight attendant appeared instantly. "Ms. Ashford, welcome aboard. It's always. Why is there a man in my seat?" Simone's smile faltered. "Not much, just enough." "I'm sorry. 2A. Carolyn pointed with one finger the way you'd point at a stain on a tablecloth. "I fly this route twice a month. I sit in 2A. I have sat in 2A for 6 years, every single time." "Let me just check for you." Simone looked down at her tablet. Her thumb moved across the screen. Her expression did something complicated, the sort of face a person makes when they discover that the truth is not going to be helpful. "Ms. Ashford, it looks like you're in 4C today." Silence, the kind of silence that has weight. 4C. "Yes, ma'am?" "An aisle." "Yes, ma'am. In row 4. I can see if anyone would be willing to—" "You can see." Carolyn repeated the words as though tasting them and finding them spoiled. Simone looked at me. "Do you know what my company spends with this airline annually, Ms. Ashford? $680,000. My people, my board, my clients, my operations. I am not a passenger, Simone. I am a revenue stream. And revenue streams do not sit in 4C. She smiled then, and it was a genuinely beautiful smile, the kind that had probably opened boardroom doors and closed negotiations, and made a great many people feel briefly and incorrectly that they were on her side, which somehow made it worse. Now fix it. James had heard every word. So had everyone else in the cabin. So had Maya, who had gone very still under her blanket, the way children go still when adults get loud. Not because they're afraid exactly, but because they are paying a different kind of attention, the kind that stores things in places they will find again years later when they least expect it. He put his hand on her knee. "Hey, look at the wing." "Dad, look at the wing, sweetheart." Simone came down the aisle toward them, and James noticed everything about the approach because he'd spent his entire adult life around airplanes and around the people who worked on them, and he had developed, without ever intending to, a very fine instrument for detecting when someone was about to deliver bad news and had been trained to make it feel like a favor. She crouched slightly beside row 2, lowered her voice, softened her eyes. Everything about her body language said, "I am on your side," and everything about the situation said she wasn't. "Sir, hi. Could I take a quick look at your boarding pass?" James took it out of his jacket pocket and handed it over. He'd checked it 4 times that morning. He knew what it said. Simone read it. Read it again. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the way a person's jaw tightens when they see something they wish they hadn't. "Everything all right?" James asked. "There may be a reservation issue. There's no issue. That's my seat. That's my daughter's seat." "I understand, sir. It's just that we're showing." She stopped, tapped the tablet, tapped it again, as if tapping it might change what it said. One moment. She walked to the galley. James watched her go, and he watched her pick up the interphone mounted on the wall, and he watched her turn her body away from the cabin as she spoke into it, angling her shoulders so that her lips couldn't be read, and something old and quiet in the back of his brain woke up and started paying very close attention. Because James Holloway had spent his entire adult life around airplanes, and he knew the way. You know, the sound of your own name. That a confirmed seat assignment does not develop a reservation issue 9 minutes before departure, while the passenger is already sitting in it. Not by accident. Carolyn Ashford did not sit in 4C. She stood in the aisle beside it with her arms folded, watching row 2 the way a woman watches an investment she's decided to acquire with patience and certainty, and the absolute expectation that the outcome was already determined, and the only remaining question was how long the other side would take to realize it. Patrick leaned in. "Ms. Ashford, we could just don't. It's a 50-minute. Patrick, if I let a 50-minute inconvenience happen to me, I have taught this airline that inconveniencing me is free." She didn't lower her voice at all. Nothing about her suggested she believed this conversation was private, or that it should be. "Nothing about me is free." Earl Jenkins, boarding with the main cabin group, passed through first class on his way to the back and caught James's eye. He didn't say anything. He just gave a small nod, the kind of nod that carries an entire sentence inside it. "I see you, brother. I see what's happening." Then he moved on. And then Simone came back, and the flight manager came with her. His name tag said B. Prescott. He was maybe 48 or 49, red-faced in the way that fair-skinned men get when they've been moving too fast and thinking too hard, with the particular energy of a man who had been called away from something else entirely and intended to solve this problem in under 90 seconds and get back to the 16 other problems that were waiting for him on the other side of that galley wall. "Folks, hi, Brian Prescott. I'm the ground operations manager for this station." He glanced at James's jacket. It was quick. It wasn't quick enough. "We've got a seating conflict here. Can I see that pass?" "You can see it. It says 2A and 2B. I bought them 11 months ago." "Sure." "Sure." Prescott looked at the boarding pass for less than 3 seconds and handed it back the way you hand back something you've already decided. "Doesn't matter." "Sir, here's the situation. Our system is showing a duplicate assignment. When that happens, we go by original issuance. And unfortunately, the original issuance here is showing Ms. Ashford." James went very still. "Say that again. Original issuance shows." "No. Say the part where you looked at my ticket for 2 seconds and then told me a story." Prescott's smile hardened the smile of a man who has done this before and has always won and cannot quite understand why the script isn't working this time. "Sir, there's no need for. I paid for these seats in September of last year." James's voice never rose. Not once. That was the thing several people in that cabin would remember afterward, when they were telling the story to their families, or their lawyers, or the reporters who would come asking. That he never raised his voice. Confirmation code. I can pull it up right now. Card statement. I can pull that up too. Seat assignment locked at purchase because I paid the fee to lock it. $29 each. $58 total. I remember because it was almost $60 I didn't want to spend, and I spent it anyway, so that this exact conversation would never happen. Prescott blinked. "So let's not do the system thing," James said. "Let's do the true thing. Whose name is on 2A? The cabin was silent. 13 other passengers in first class were now watching openly the way people watch when they sense that something is happening, that they will be asked about later." Prescott looked at the tablet in Simone's hands. Simone looked at the floor. Sir Prescott said, "I need you to move." Maya's hand came out from under the blanket and closed around her father's wrist. Her fingers were small and warm and held on with a strength that had nothing to do with muscle, and James felt it in a place that was older than years. The place where a father keeps the things his child has taught him about the world, and what she was teaching him right now, at this moment, with her small hand around his wrist, was that she already knew. She was 9 years old, and she already knew the shape of adults deciding something about her family. "Dad," her voice was very small. "It's okay. Are we in trouble?" And there it was. James had been hit in the face once at 19, in a bar he shouldn't have been in. He'd been under a jet engine that dropped 4 inches with his arm still inside the cowling. He'd been standing in a hospital hallway when a doctor came through a door and didn't have to say anything at all, because his face said all of it. None of that landed like "Are we in trouble?" He turned in his seat so that his back was to Prescott. so that his back was to Carolyn Ashford and her camel coat and her platinum hair and her $680,000. So that for 1 second, one single second in the middle of everything that was happening and everything that was about to happen, there was nobody in the world but the two of them. "Look at me," he said. "Are you looking?" "Yes, we did nothing wrong." "Do you hear me?" "Not one thing. You didn't do anything wrong, and I didn't do anything wrong. Some grown-ups are making a bad choice right now, and that's on them. It is not on us." But they said, I know what they said. He tucked her hair behind her ear, the way he'd been doing since she was 4, the small automatic gesture that had survived everything. The hospital and the funeral, and the 11 months, and all the, not this month, sweethearts that had piled up between then and now. Sweetheart, listen. When people look at somebody and decide what they're worth before they've said a single word, that's the smallest thing a person can do. And we are not going to be small back. Okay? Maya's eyes were wet. She nodded. That's my girl. He straightened up, and when he turned back around, his face had changed. Not angry. Cleared. Like a man who has been holding 2 things in his hands and has set one of them down and picked up something different, something heavier and more precise. "Mr. Prescott." "Sir, I really do need I heard you. I want to ask you something first, and I want you to answer it in front of everybody who's sitting here." James's voice was calm and level, and it carried the way voices carry when they're not trying to fill a room, but are simply occupying the space they've earned. "Is there anything wrong with my ticket?" Prescott hesitated. His eyes went to the tablet, to Simone, to the galley, to the dozen small escape routes his brain was offering him, and then back to the man standing in the aisle who was not going anywhere. "It's a system. That's not what I asked. Is there anything wrong with the ticket I'm holding in my hand?" "No, sir. The ticket appears valid. Thank you." James nodded once. "Second question. Did anyone open my reservation record in the last 15 minutes? Simone's head came up. It was fast, a half second at most, the involuntary reflex of a person who has just heard something she wasn't expecting. And James caught it. And so did a man in 3D, named Nathan Fielding, a forensic accountant in a gray sweater, the sort of man airlines never notice, who would later describe that exact half second to 3 different investigators with the meticulous precision of a man who does not use the word approximately unless he means it. "I wouldn't have that information," Prescott said. "You'd have it in about 4 keystrokes." "Sir, because here's what I know." James finally stood, and it was noticeable to everybody in that cabin that he was taller than he'd looked sitting down, and that his shoulders were the shoulders of a man who lifted things for a living. Heavy things, engine blocks, and landing gear assemblies, and the accumulated weight of 11 months of work that had come down to this exact moment. He wasn't threatening. He just took up his actual space for the first time. A locked seat assignment doesn't unlock itself. Somebody has to override it. And every override in your system leaves a name, a station code, and a timestamp. So if this is a computer error, that record's going to show a computer. He let the sentence sit there alone in the middle of the silence. And if it's not, it's going to show a person. Prescott's face went from red to a shade that nobody has a name for the color of a man who has just realized he is standing in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong story, and the walls are getting closer. From the aisle behind them, Carolyn Ashford laughed. It was a light, pleasant, absolutely devastating sound. The laugh of a woman who is watching someone else's problem with the detached amusement of a person who has never once considered the possibility that the problem might be hers. "Oh, for God's sake," she said, stepping forward. "You've made your point. You're very well informed for a—" And here she paused, and her eyes went deliberately and unhurriedly from James's boots to his jeans to the burn hole in his jacket sleeve, to his face, And the pause was the thing. The pause was where she put everything she wasn't going to say out loud. The entire inventory of assumptions and calculations and conclusions that she had arrived at. In the first 3 seconds, she'd laid eyes on him and had never once revisited. For a man in that jacket, somebody in row 1 made a small noise, the involuntary sound of a person who has just heard something cross a line they didn't know was there. James looked at her for a long moment. "You want to say the rest of it? I'm sorry. You started a sentence and you quit halfway. Go ahead and finish it. There's a 9-year-old right here who's going to hear it either way, so you might as well say it clean." Carolyn's chin lifted a fraction of an inch. "I think she said that some people misunderstand what VIP means. What does it mean? It means priority. Priority over what?" "Over inconvenience, over people," James said quietly. "That's what you mean. You just don't want to say it in front of the kid." Sir Prescott stepped between them, his hands, up palms out, the universal gesture of a man who would very much like everyone to stop saying true things. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to lower. I haven't raised my voice one time." James didn't look away from Carolyn. "Ma'am, I want to make sure I understand. You've got a valid seat on this airplane. 4C. Nobody's taking it from you. You'll land in Charleston at the same minute I do. So this isn't about getting there. This is about where. It's about standards," Carolyn said. "Mine. And frankly, whether you like it or not, this airline's. There is a reason there is a curtain between this cabin and that one. It isn't decorative. And that several passengers agreed later was the moment the cabin turned. Because up until then, a number of people in first class had been quietly on Carolyn's side, not out of cruelty, not even out of any particular conviction, but out of habit, out of the 1,000 small assumptions that people make, without noticing that a well-dressed woman with an assistant is probably in the right, and a tired man in work boots has probably made a mistake that money is a kind of credential, and its absence is a kind of explanation. But she said the curtain isn't decorative, and a retired schoolteacher in 1C named Dorothy Mitchell, who had spent 31 years in a 4th-grade classroom and had developed an extremely sensitive instrument for detecting when a powerful person was using good grammar to say a terrible thing, put down her orange juice and said out loud to nobody in particular, "Good Lord." Prescott made his decision. Okay, folks. Here's what we're going to do." He clapped his hands once the way men do when they want a conversation to be over and have confused the sound of their own hands with the sound of authority. "Sir, we've got a seat available in the main cabin, row 28. I can get you a full refund on the fare difference, plus a $200 travel voucher, and I'll personally make sure both seats. I'm sorry." "Are you moving both of us to row 28? Prescott looked at his tablet. Then he looked at Simone. Then he did something James would remember for the rest of his life. He looked at his shoes. "We have one seat available," Prescott said. "The flight's full, sir. Your daughter can stay right here in 2B and she'll be extremely well looked after. Our crew is say the rest of it. And you'd be in 28E. 20 on ooh," James repeated flatly. "Middle seat. 26 rows back, behind 2 bulkheads and a curtain. Separated from a 9-year-old on her first flight in her life. It's a 52-minute flight, sir." James's voice dropped, and it got, if anything, gentler. "Do you have kids?" Prescott's mouth opened. Closed. 2, he said. "How old?" 6 and 11. "Would you sit in 28E? Nobody said anything. The silence answered the question better than any words could have. "That's what I thought," James said. Simone spoke up then for the first time since the galley, and her voice was thin and tight, and full of something she probably couldn't have named if somebody had asked her. "Sir, I'd keep an eye on her the whole flight. I promise. I'd sit with her during cruise if I could." And James looked at her, and there was no anger in it at all, which was somehow worse, because anger is a thing people know how to defend against. And what was in his face? Instead was something quieter and heavier, The look of a man who can see exactly what is happening to someone and knows there is nothing he can do about it, except tell them the truth. "I believe you," he said. "I think you'd do that. I think you're a decent person who's about to do an indecent thing because somebody with a title told you to, and you're going to carry it around a lot longer than you think." Simone's eyes filled. She turned away fast. That was when Carolyn took the backpack. Later, she would insist she was simply clearing the seat area. 14 people would remember it differently, and one of them would have it on video. She reached down past Maya, past the small body curled under the blanket, past the child who had been sitting perfectly still for 6 minutes, trying to make herself as small as possible, so that the loud adults might forget she was there. And she took the purple backpack out from under the seat by one strap and swung it into the aisle with a motion that was casual and practiced and utterly devoid of hesitation. The motion of a woman removing an obstruction, a thing that was in the way of something she wanted. It hit the galley wall and slid, and the zipper burst, and a small yellow notebook and a plastic horse came skittering out across the carpet, and Maya made a sound. Not a cry, not a word, just a sound. And the entire first-class cabin of Pinnacle Airways. Flight 1083 heard a 9-year-old girl make a sound she should never have had to make. James moved, not toward Carolyn. He stepped past her without looking at her, knelt in the aisle, and picked up the notebook. He picked up the plastic horse. He put them back in the bag and zipped what was left of the zipper. And he did it slowly, carefully, with the hands of a man who fixes things for a living and has never once in his life been rough with something that mattered. And the cabin watched him do it, and the silence got so heavy you could hear the jet bridge groaning outside the aircraft door. Then he stood up and handed the backpack to his daughter. "Everything's here," he said. "Nothing's broken. The zipper's broken. I'll fix it tonight. You always say that. I always do it." Maya made a wet little laugh, the kind that's half grief and half trust, and Dorothy Mitchell in 1C put her hand over her mouth and kept it there. James turned around. Carolyn had taken a half-step back, and for the first time in the entire encounter, something in her posture suggested she was aware that the room had changed around her, that the 14 people in these seats were no longer watching a dispute, but witnessing something else entirely, something that would follow her. "Ms. Ashford, I was clearing the I want to tell you something, and then I'm going to stop talking to you for the rest of my life." He said it without heat. That was the frightening part. Not cold, not angry, just finished the voice of a man who has reached the end of a conversation he never wanted to have. You didn't just take a seat. Anybody can take a seat. What you did was you taught a 9-year-old girl that when a person with money wants something, the rules bend. And she's going to carry that. Not today, not this week, but later, when it counts. She's going to carry it into her first job interview and her first apartment application, and the first time somebody looks at her and decides something before she said a word. You put that in her today. For a window seat on a 52-minute flight, Carolyn's mouth was a thin, hard line. "You don't know anything about me." "No, ma'am," James agreed. "I don't. But I'm about to." He picked up his duffel bag, and then he did the part that nobody expected, and it was the part that mattered most. He didn't refuse. He didn't demand a supervisor above Prescott. He didn't get himself dragged off an airplane in a viral video so that strangers could argue about him on the internet for 3 days and then forget. He knelt down one more time next to 2B and whispered something to Maya that nobody else in the cabin could hear, and she looked at him with those enormous, serious eyes and nodded once, and he straightened up and picked up his bag and walked 26 rows to the back of the airplane and sat down in a middle seat between a college kid with headphones and a woman with a sleeping infant. He did not look back. What he'd whispered to Maya was this count to 300 for me. Slow. When you get to 300, look up. She'd asked why. Because I want you to see something. Earl Jenkins, settling into his own seat in the main cabin, watched James pass and said nothing. But his hand came up off the armrest for half a second, and James saw it, and that was enough. In seat 28E, middle seat. Last section behind 2 bulkheads and a curtain, and 26 rows of people who had no idea what had just happened in the front of the airplane. James Holloway did not open a social media app. He did not call a lawyer. He did not text a friend or a family member or anyone at all. He opened his phone's notes app, and he began to type in the flat, unhurried way of a man filling out a maintenance log. Because that was what. This was a record of damage. Documented the way he'd been trained to document damage, with times and names and facts, and no adjectives at all, because adjectives were opinions, and opinions could be argued with. But a timestamp was a timestamp, and a name was a name, and those things held up under pressure, the way a good wing held up under load. 0847, Simone Torres F.A. reviewed boarding pass, confirmed, valid. Escalated to OPS manager. 0851, Prescott ground. Ops MGR reviewed BP approx 2 cc. Claimed original issuance showed Ashford. False. Refused to state override source. 0853, locked seat assignment, 2A, altered post-boarding. Override required station code, plus agent ID, recoverable. 0856, passenger C. Ashford stated annual spend, $680K as basis for reassignment. Witnessed by full FC cabin. The minor child 9 separated from sole parent. No unaccompanied minor protocol offered. No consent requested. No consent obtained. 0558, property of minor removed from seat area by third party. Backpack thrown. Zipper damaged. Child distressed. He read it back once, checking each entry against his memory, the way he'd check a parts list against a schematic, looking for the gap, the thing he'd missed, the detail that would matter later when the details were all that mattered. Then he added one more line, and he looked at it for a long time before he typed it, because it was the line that made everything else true, and the truth of it sat in his chest like a hot coal. I let it happen on purpose, because that was the truth, and he'd known it since the moment Brian Prescott looked at his shoes. He could have stopped it in 11 seconds. 11 seconds, and one phone call, and Gregory Brian Prescott would have been escorted off his own jet bridge before the boarding music finished playing. Simone Torres would have been standing at attention. The station manager would have been running from Terminal 3 with his tie coming undone. And Carolyn Ashford would have been sitting in 4C with a glass of water and a new understanding of the word priority. James had known that the entire time. He had sat there with that knowledge in his chest, burning with his daughter's hand around his wrist, and he had chosen deliberately and with full awareness of what it cost not to use it, because he'd needed to know. Not whether they'd treat him fairly. He already knew the answer to that. He'd spent 11 months in a workshop in Rockford, being called "Hey Buddy" by men who'd have called him "Sir" if they'd known what he signed. Being handed the worst shifts and the dirtiest jobs because he never complained and never pulled rank and never once said the sentence that would have changed everything, because saying it would have meant he was using it, and using it meant he didn't know what it was like not to have it. He needed to know what happened to the man with no leverage at all, the man in the brown jacket, the man with the burn hole in the sleeve, and the 9-year-old daughter and the boarding pass he'd paid for with 11 months of overtime, the one who couldn't threaten anybody, couldn't call anybody, couldn't do anything at all except hold up a ticket and ask in a reasonable voice to be allowed to sit in his own seat, next to his own child. Now he knew. In seat 2B, Maya Holloway was at 211. She was counting on the pads of her fingers instead of the tips, which was her mother's habit, one of those small inherited gestures that travel from body to body without anyone noticing, like the shape of a laugh or the way a person holds a pen. She was not crying where people could see, which was her father's habit. One he'd never taught her, because he'd never had to. Because children learn the important things, not from what you tell them, but from what you show them. And James Holloway had shown her, without ever meaning to, that there were some things you carried quietly. The blanket was still folded across her lap. Nobody had taken it away. And Carolyn was sitting one seat over in 2A, scrolling through her phone with her legs crossed, and had not looked at Maya once in 11 minutes. Not once. Not a glance. Not a sideways flicker. Not the smallest acknowledgement that the seat she was sitting in had been purchased by a man who had packed his own lunch for a year so that his daughter could have this morning. 240. Simone came down the aisle with a glass of orange juice that nobody had asked for. "Sweetheart, would you like?" "No, thank you," Maya said. 246. Simone stopped. "I'm sorry, I'm counting to 300. My dad told me to." Something happened in Simone Torres's face. A shift. A fracture. The look of a person who has just been reminded of something they were trying very hard not to think about. Why, she asked quietly. Because he said, "I'd see something." 260. Simone straightened up slowly, still holding the orange juice, and looked toward the front of the airplane where the cockpit door had just opened. 271. The first officer stepped out. He did not look at the passengers. He walked directly to the forward galley phone, picked it up, and stood with his back to the cabin for 11 seconds, and his posture changed twice during those 11 seconds, and anyone who had ever delivered bad news or received it would have recognized both changes. 284. He hung up. He said something to Keith, the rear flight attendant who had appeared at his elbow with the particular speed of a man who has been waiting for exactly this moment without knowing what it was. Keith nodded once. 292. The engines which had been spooling up to taxi power spooled back down. The high whine dropped to a low hum and then to something that was almost silence. Almost, but not quite. Because an airplane is never truly silent. It just gets quiet enough for you to hear the things it's been saying all along. The cabin lights, which had dimmed for departure, came back up to full. 298. The jet bridge, which had pulled back from the aircraft door 4 minutes earlier, began with a low mechanical groan that every experienced traveler on that airplane recognized instantly, and none of them could believe to move forward again. 300. Maya Holloway looked up, and over the PA in a voice that was doing an extremely poor job of sounding routine, the captain of Pinnacle Airways. Flight 1083 said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the flight deck. I need everyone to remain seated. We are returning to the gate." Carolyn Ashford's head came up from her phone for the first time in 11 minutes. What she said. Nobody answered her. In seat 28E, 26 rows back, a man in a brown jacket with a burn hole in the sleeve unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. What had happened was this. James had hit the call button 6 minutes earlier, and a flight attendant named Keith, a man in his 40s who had been doing this job for 15 years and had developed over the course of roughly 22,000 flights a very precise understanding of the difference between a passenger who wants a pillow and a passenger who is about to change the trajectory of an entire shift, had leaned over his seat. "Yes, sir. Everything okay? I need you to get a message to the flight deck." Keith's smile stayed, but his eyes sharpened. "Sir, we're about to push. Anything you need, I can, Keith." James turned his phone around so the man could read the screen. "I need you to read this, and then I need you to decide very fast what kind of day you're going to have." Keith read it. His hand came off the seat back. The color left his face and came back in a different arrangement. "Sir," he said. And his voice had changed entirely the way a voice changes when the person speaking has suddenly realized they are standing in a room with someone they didn't expect, and the room is a lot smaller than they thought. "Would you please come with me to the forward galley?" "No," James said. "I'm not going anywhere. I want it done from right here where 40 people can watch it get done. Tell the captain that." He handed Keith a card from his wallet. Plain white, no logo, no name, no title, 11 digits, and nothing else printed in a font so small you had to hold it under a light to read it. "And tell him to call that number before we move 1 inch. Keith looked at the card. Then he looked at James. Then he went up the aisle faster than any flight attendant has ever walked, without technically running his shoes, making that particular sound on the aircraft carpet. That means something is about to happen. And 38 passengers in the main cabin watched him go, and not one of them knew what they were watching, and every one of them felt it. Now James stood, and he walked up that aisle at the exact same pace he'd walked down it 11 minutes earlier. 26 rows, the same carpet, the same overhead bins, the same curtain at the front, the same man in the same jacket. But the airplane had stopped, and the doors were about to open, and the man in the jacket was not the same man at all, or rather, he was exactly the same man he'd been the entire time, and the airplane was about to find that out. James pushed the curtain aside with the back of his hand, and first class had turned into a different country in the 11 minutes since he'd left it. Brian Prescott was standing in the forward galley, with his tablet held against his chest like a shield, talking fast and low to Rhonda, a gate agent who had come aboard, and was shaking her head in the particular way of a person who has been handed a problem she did not create and cannot solve, and would very much like to hand back. Simone Torres was standing at the aircraft door with her hands at her sides, not doing anything at all, which for a flight attendant was the loudest possible statement, the physical equivalent of a person who has decided to stop participating in something they can no longer defend. Carolyn Ashford was on her phone in 2A with her legs crossed and her voice pitched to Carrie. "No, they've stopped the aircraft." "Yes, stopped it. Patrick, I want you to call Whitmore's office directly. Not the assistant, the office. And in 2B, a 9-year-old girl was sitting perfectly straight, with a broken purple backpack in her lap, looking up the aisle with an expression that was too old for her face. The expression of a child who has been counting, and has reached the number, and is now waiting to see what the number was for. James crouched in the aisle beside her. 300, Maya said. 300. The plane went backwards. It did. Dad. Her voice wobbled for the first time all morning, a small crack in the composure she'd been holding together with both hands for 20 minutes. "Did we get in trouble?" "No, sweetheart." He put his hand over her small, folded hands. "Somebody else did." Prescott saw him then, and came out of the galley at a speed that suggested he had been standing in there for 11 minutes, looking for a target, and had finally found one. "Sir, you need to sit down. You are not permitted to be in this cabin. You have been reseated to 28E, and I need you to return to." "Why is the airplane at the gate?" Prescott's mouth worked the silent preamble of a man sorting through possible answers and finding that none of them are good. "That is an operational matter. It's an operational matter." James nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's been handed a part number that doesn't match the box. "Okay, then let me ask you an easier one. About 10 minutes ago you told me the original issuance on seat 2A was Ms. Ashford. Do you still want to say that I'm not going to litigate?" "It's a yes or a no. Sir, I have a departure to run." "You don't," James said. "Not anymore. That's what the gate coming back means." Something shifted in Brian Prescott's face, the subtle rearrangement of a man who had spent 19 years learning that a raised voice and a badge and a clipboard would end almost any conversation on an airplane, and who was discovering at this exact moment the outer edge of that assumption, the place where it stopped working, the cliff where the ground ran out. So he reached for the last tool in the drawer. "Rhonda," he called to the gate agent, "get me the duty officer. We've got a disruptive passenger refusing crew instruction." The cabin heard it. Every word. Dorothy Mitchell, the retired schoolteacher in 1C, took her reading glasses off and set them on the armrest with a click that was louder than it should have been because the cabin was that quiet, and said, "Absolutely not. Ma'am, this doesn't concern. I taught 4th grade for 31 years, young man, and I know a lie when it's told at volume." She turned in her seat to face the rest of the cabin, and her eyes swept the rows the way a teacher's eyes sweep a classroom when she's about to ask a question and expects an answer. Did anybody hear that man raise his voice? Anybody one time? Silence. Then from 3D, a soft, dry voice, the voice of a man who had been sitting quietly in a gray sweater for 35 minutes and had not drawn attention to himself, because drawing attention to yourself was the opposite of how Nathan Fielding did his job. He never raised it once. Everyone looked. Nathan Fielding, 44, forensic accountant, the sort of man who made his living by sitting in rooms where people didn't want him and reading documents they wished he wouldn't. He had his phone in his hand, screen up, and he lifted it slightly so that Prescott could see it. "I've been recording since the backpack," Nathan said. "That's 4 minutes and 11 seconds of continuous video." He never raised his voice. He never obstructed the aisle. And he complied with a crew instruction that I would very much like somebody to explain to me the legal basis. 4. Prescott's jaw set. "So recording crew members is against—" "No, it isn't." Nathan said it the way he said everything, as if he were reading a figure off a spreadsheet. "It's against your policy, which is not a law. And your policy also says a confirmed seat assignment can't be reassigned for revenue tier preference. I'd like to talk about which of your policies we're taking seriously today." Somebody in row 1 laughed. It was not a friendly laugh. Carolyn lowered her phone. "This is absurd." She stood up, and she was very good at standing up, the kind of woman who had learned long ago that the physical act of rising to her feet was itself a form of argument. "May I say something? May I say something?" She repeated, not waiting for permission, because permission was a thing other people needed. "I have flown this airline 400 and some times. I have never, not once, asked for anything I was not entitled to. I asked a question at the door. One question. Everything that has happened since then has been the decision of your employees, not mine. If your people made an error, that is your people. I did not touch a keyboard." "That's true," James said. Every head in the cabin turned. "I'm sorry," Carolyn said. "You didn't touch a keyboard." James looked at Prescott. He did. Or somebody standing next to him did. "That's what I've been trying to get on the record for 20 minutes. And every time I ask, I get a word like issuance or operational." He turned back to Carolyn. "You didn't change anything, ma'am. You just made it clear what you were worth, and then you stood in the aisle and let somebody else do the arithmetic. That's a very poetic accusation." "It's not an accusation. It's the whole business model." James's voice was steady and unhurried, the voice of a man who has had a long time to think about what he's saying and is choosing every word the way he'd choose a tool from a rack. Nobody in a company ever tells an employee to break a rule for a big customer. You don't have to. You just make sure everybody knows who the big customer is, and then you look the other way when the rule breaks by itself. Then when it comes apart, you get to say exactly what you just said. "I didn't touch a keyboard." For a moment, a half second, no more, something flickered behind Carolyn Ashford's face that was not anger and was not calculation, and might, if you caught it at the right angle, have been something very close to recognition. Then it was gone. "Who are you?" she said. "A guy who fixes airplanes." "No," she said slowly. "You're not." The duty officer arrived 4 minutes later, and his name was Sergeant Dan Morales, Airport Police. 26 years on the job, a man built like a fire hydrant, with a mustache that had survived 3 decades of departmental grooming policies through what could only be described as institutional stubbornness. He came up the jet bridge expecting exactly what he'd been told: he was getting a hostile passenger in the forward cabin who had refused reseating and was making threats. What he found was a full first-class cabin sitting in dead silence, a flight manager sweating through his collar, a little girl holding a broken purple backpack, and a man in work boots, standing calmly in the aisle with his hands visible and open at his sides, the way people stand when they've thought about it in advance, when they know what it looks like. When a black man is standing in a space where someone has called the police, and they have made the decision conscious and deliberate to remove every possible excuse. Morales had been doing this long enough to read a room in under 3 seconds. He read this one in 2. "All right," he said. "Who called me? I did." Prescott stepped forward fast the way men step forward when they're relieved to see reinforcement. Brian Prescott, ground ops. This passenger was reseated for a documented reservation conflict, refused to remain in his assigned seat, returned to a cabin he isn't ticketed for, and has been intimidating my crew. Uh-huh. Morales looked at James. "Sir, you want to give me your version? I bought seats 2A and 2B 11 months ago. My daughter's in 2B right now. 20 minutes ago I was told there was a system conflict and asked to move to 28E. I complied. I got up when the aircraft returned to the gate because my 9-year-old was sitting alone up here, and I wanted to be next to her. That's it. That's it. That's it." Morales looked at Prescott. "That's it. That is a selective." Sergeant Dorothy Mitchell raised her hand exactly the way she'd raised it in approximately 11,000 faculty meetings over the course of 31 years. Except this time, she was the one calling on people. "May I go ahead, ma'am? Everything that man just said is true, and he left out that the woman in 2A threw the child's backpack down the aisle and broke it." Morales's chin came up half an inch, the minimal physical response of a man who has just heard something he did not expect and is recalibrating. "Somebody threw a kid's bag. I moved an obstruction," Carolyn said. "It was under the seat," Nathan Fielding said from 3D, "where the FAA requires it to be." On video. Morales exhaled slowly through his nose, which anybody who had ever worked with him would have recognized as the sound of a very long shift, getting significantly longer. "Okay," he said. "Mr. Prescott, walk me through the reservation conflict." Prescott glanced at his tablet. "It's a system-generated duplicate." "Fine. Show me the duplicate. The record's been updated. Then show me the record." Prescott didn't move. And that was the moment when several people noticed it independently, and all of them mentioned it later, that Simone Torres, 26 years old, 3 years with the airline, standing at the aircraft door, where she had been very still for 11 minutes, doing nothing at all, stepped forward. "I can show you the record," she said. "Simone." Prescott's voice was a warning, the voice of a man who has just realized that the person he assumed was on his side has been standing at the door, making a different decision for the past 11 minutes. He asked to see the record. Simone. She held out her tablet to the sergeant, and her hand was shaking so hard the screen wobbled, and the light from it bounced off the galley wall, and she said it anyway. At 8:49 this morning, seat 2A was showing J. Holloway, locked at purchase with a paid seat lock fee. At 8:53, the assignment was overridden and reissued to C. Ashford. The override was entered from Station Terminal OAR DDF 14, which is the podium at Gate 12 under supervisor credentials. She swallowed. Mr. Prescott's credentials. Nobody breathed. And at 8:55, Simone said a status flag was added to Mr. Holloway's record. The flag reads in capital letters, "PAX voluntarily accepted downgrade." James Holloway closed his eyes for 1 second. Not in surprise. He'd known. He'd known since 28E, since the hot coal in his chest, since the moment he'd typed, "I let it happen on purpose." But knowing a thing and hearing it read out loud in a quiet cabin are two different animals, and the second one has teeth. "I never said that," he said. "I never signed anything. Nobody asked me." "I know," Simone said. "I was standing right there." Morales took his hat off, which for him was a fairly extreme gesture, the equivalent of another man throwing a chair. "Mr. Prescott," he said, "I'm going to ask you one time in front of witnesses, and I'd think about it real carefully. Did you enter a note in a federal air carrier record stating that this man consented to something he did not consent to? That's a standard operational and not yes or no. You don't understand how the system—" "It's not complicated," James said quietly. He wrote down that, "I agreed." "I didn't agree. That's the whole thing. It's a notation. It's a document." Nathan Fielding hadn't raised his voice either, and somehow that was becoming the tone of the entire cabin, everyone speaking softer and softer, while the thing at the center got louder. "I do this for a living, Mr. Prescott. When there's an incident, that's the record that gets pulled. That note isn't housekeeping. That note is the entire defense of your company in a claim. And you wrote it about a man who was sitting 26 rows back, holding his phone. Prescott's tablet was trembling against his chest. I have a station to run. We had a 9-minute delay building." "I made a call." "You made a call," James said. Yes, I made a call. That's my job. You make 100 calls a day, and half of them are ugly. And you pick the one that gets the airplane out the door." "And which door was I standing in front of?" Prescott stopped. "Say it," James said. "Because I've been standing here 25 minutes, and nobody in a uniform has said the true sentence out loud, and I would like somebody to say it before we go one step further. What was the actual reason you moved me? The cabin waited." Brian Prescott, 49 years old, 2 kids aged 6 and 11, 19 years with Pinnacle Airways, a man who had once driven 40 miles in an ice storm at 2 in the morning to bring a lost wheelchair to an 80-year-old woman's hotel room because he couldn't stand the thought of her waking up without it, stood in the aisle of a stopped airplane and heard himself say, "Because she was going to make a phone call, and you weren't." Dorothy Mitchell made a small sound. "That's it," Prescott said, and his voice cracked open like something that had been holding pressure for 19 years and had finally found the seam. "That's it. That's the reason. She spends $600,000 a year, and she knows 2 vice presidents by their first names. And you had a paper ticket sleeve, and a kid, and a jacket. And I've had 4 escalations this quarter, and 1 more, and I'm on a plan. And I looked at both of you, and I did the math in about 6 seconds, and I picked," his voice broke, "I picked the one who couldn't hurt me." Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then James said, "Thank you." Prescott looked up, wrecked. "Thank you. That's the first honest sentence I've heard on this airplane." James's voice had no cruelty in it at all. "And it's going to matter later. Remember that you said it." Carolyn Ashford had been quiet for 3 minutes, which for her was a geological era. She had made 4 phone calls in those minutes, and not one of them had gone the way it was supposed to. The first was to Patrick, who was already in a car on the way to the rental counter and already had bad news. "The story's out. There's video. Somebody in 3D uploaded 4 minutes of it, and it's got 60,000 views. It's climbing fast." The second was to her communications director, who said the word optics 9 times and the word narrative 7, and who was clearly composing a statement in his head while she was still talking. Which was the thing about communications directors. They were always writing the next version of you before the current version had finished happening. The third was to a Pinnacle Airways vice president, whose direct line she'd had for 4 years, and who had picked up every single time she'd called since 2022, and this time it went to voicemail. And the silence of that voicemail was louder than anything anyone had said on this airplane all morning. The fourth call was to her daughter. That one she hadn't planned. Mom Lauren Ashford, 28, a pediatric resident in Denver, answered on the 4th ring, sounding like she'd been asleep for 90 minutes after an 18-hour shift, which she had. "Is everything okay?" "Yes. Fine. Everything's fine." "Okay. Then why are you calling at 9 in the morning? You never call before noon, unless something's..." There's a situation on a flight. Are you hurt? No. Is the plane okay? The plane's fine. Lauren. A rustle. Sitting up. What's going on? There was a seating error, Carolyn said. And I handled it badly. A long pause on the line. The kind of pause that has texture that tells you the person on the other end is not thinking about what you said, but about all the other times you've said something like it. How badly there's a child, Carolyn said. The pause got longer. Mom, Lauren said, and her voice had changed the way a voice changes when someone stops being your daughter for a moment and becomes instead the kind of person who has spent 4 years in a pediatric ward watching what happens to children when the adults around them make decisions without considering that children are in the room. Did you do the thing? What thing? The thing you did at Aspen. The thing you did to the girl at the front desk in Zurich. The thing where somebody in a uniform is standing there and you make it very clear how much you're worth, and you watch them rearrange the room around you. That's not. Did you do it in front of a kid? Carolyn Ashford sat in seat 2A, a seat that was not hers, on an airplane that was not moving in front of 13 people who were not looking at her and were also not looking at anything else and said nothing at all. Okay, Lauren said quietly. Okay, I have to go back to sleep. Call me when you land. Lauren, Mom. Her daughter's voice was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the shift. You know what the worst part is? I wasn't surprised. Not for a second. The line went dead. Carolyn lowered the phone very slowly and set it face down on the armrest. 2 feet away, a 9-year-old girl was showing a broken zipper to a flight attendant who was kneeling in the aisle with tears on her face. At 9:52, the sound of the jet bridge door changed. Everybody heard it. Airplanes have a small vocabulary of sounds, and this was one of them, and it meant somebody had come through the outer door and was coming down the corridor, and the footsteps were multiple, and they were not hurrying, and nobody was talking, which was somehow the worst sign of all. Morales put his hat back on. Rhonda stepped out of the way. Prescott straightened his tie, and the door filled. 4 people came aboard. A woman in her 60s in a navy suit with a laminate on a lanyard that read, Pinnacle Corporate. A younger man with a laptop bag and the particular gray complexion of someone who had been on a conference call since 9 o'clock and had not yet processed what the call was about. A woman with a legal pad, and behind them, a tall man with white hair and a scar on the back of one hand, who did not have a laminate at all, because in 31 years, nobody at that company had ever once asked him for one. The woman in navy scanned the cabin fast the way people do when they've been given a name and no face. I'm looking for, she started. And the white-haired man stepped past her and looked down the aisle and stopped. He looked at the man in the brown work jacket with the burn hole in the sleeve standing beside seat 2B with his hand on a 9-year-old's shoulder, and he said out loud, in a voice that carried the whole length of first class, "Oh hell, nobody moved," James, the white-haired man, said. "Son, please tell me you weren't on this one." Brian Prescott turned his head very slowly. Carolyn Ashford looked up from the armrest, and James Holloway said quietly, "Hey, Cal. Yeah, I was on this one." For about 3 seconds, nothing happened at all. Then Robert Calloway, 68 years old, president of Pinnacle Airways, 41 years in the industry, 31 of them at this company, a man who had personally signed off on the purchase of every aircraft in the fleet since 2009, and who had started his career as a 21-year-old mechanic in a hangar in Rockford, Illinois, standing next to a man named Ray Sutherland, who would go on to build an airline, walked down the aisle of Flight 1083 past 4 executives, 1 police sergeant, 1 gate agent, and 13 paying passengers, and stopped in front of a mechanic in a brown jacket. "James," Cal's voice had dropped. "Is she all right?" That was the first question. Not what happened, not who did this, not how bad is this going to be. He looked past James at the 9-year-old in seat 2B, holding a purple backpack with a broken zipper, and he asked if she was all right. "She's okay," James said. Cal crouched. Actually. Crouched, knees popping like gunshots in the silent cabin, the sound of a 68-year-old man deciding that his dignity mattered less than being at eye level with a child. "Maya, you remember me?" Maya studied him with the careful evaluative expression of a 9-year-old who does not give away her recognitions cheaply. "You gave me a wrench. I gave you a torque wrench for Christmas. That is correct." It was a wrench, Maya said with the profound moral seriousness of a 9-year-old relitigating a 2-year-old grievance that she had in no way moved past. "It was a torque wrench," Cal said. "And it was a good one, and someday you'll thank me." He looked at the backpack, then at the burst zipper, then slowly at nothing in particular, the way people look when they're seeing something that isn't in front of them, but behind them, in a place where the anger lives. "Somebody want to tell me how that got broken?" Nobody in first class said a word. "Okay," Cal said, standing back up. "Okay." Cal turned around and the entire cabin got its first look at what a genuinely angry 68-year-old man looks like when he has spent 4 decades learning not to show it, and has decided just this once to let the edges come through. "Who's the station manager?" Rhonda raised a hand about 6 inches. "He's on his way from Terminal 3, sir. He's on his way. 22 minutes since the hold went out, and he's on his way." "All right. Who's the ground ops manager?" Silence. "I've got a name on a piece of paper," Cal said. "So this is a courtesy." Brian Prescott stepped forward. His tie was straight. His hands were not. "Brian Prescott, sir. Mr. Prescott." Cal looked at him for a long moment, the way a man looks at a piece of machinery that has failed, in a way he didn't expect, and is trying to determine whether the failure was in the design or the maintenance. "You know who I am?" "Yes, sir." "Say it out loud, please. For the cabin." Prescott swallowed. "You're Mr. Calloway. You're the president of the airline." "That's right." Cal turned slightly so that he was addressing the whole forward cabin and none of it. "And I want everybody in this section to understand something before we go one step further, because in about 90 seconds, a bunch of you are going to feel very good about yourselves for being on the right side of this, and I'd like to head that off." He pointed at James without looking at him. "That man does not work for me." Prescott blinked. "I work for him." Somebody in row 1 said, "What?" And it came out as less of a word and more of a sound. The verbal equivalent of a person missing a step on a staircase. Carolyn Ashford did not say anything. She had gone completely still in seat 2A, and her hands were flat on the armrests, and she was looking at the man in the brown jacket, the way you look at a word you have read 400 times, and have suddenly realized you have been pronouncing wrong your entire life. Cal James said, "Don't." "Nope, I've taken that from you for 2 years," Cal said, "and it stops on this airplane." He turned to the woman in the navy suit. "Janet." "Badge." Janet Langford stepped forward and held up a laminate. For anyone who can't see it, Cal said that says, Pinnacle Airways. Pinnacle is not a company. Pinnacle is a subsidiary. There is a holding company above it called Crestline Holdings. And Crestline owns this airplane, this gate, that jet bridge, my paycheck, Mr. Prescott's paycheck, and the carpet you're all standing on. He put his hand on James's shoulder. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is James Holloway. He is the chairman of the board of Crestline Holdings. He has been for 2 years. He has never taken a dollar of salary for it. He has never had an office. And up until about 11 minutes ago, I was the only person in this terminal who knew what he looked like." The cabin made a sound, not a gasp. Something lower and uglier, the sound of 14 people's stomachs relocating at the same time, the sound of every assumption and every calculation and every 6-second piece of arithmetic that had been done in this cabin over the past 30 minutes, being reversed at once. Simone Torres sat down. Not in a seat. On the galley floor, with her back against the cabinet, in full view of everyone, as if her legs had simply been switched off. Brian Prescott said, "Oh my God." And then, louder, I told him to sit in 28E. I stood right there, and Mr. Prescott, breathe. Cal's voice cut through it like a hand on a shoulder. Nobody's firing anybody in an aisle. That's not how this works. Prescott put both hands on a seatback and breathed, and James stood there in the middle of all of it, with his hand still on his daughter's shoulder, and looked to everyone watching like the most uncomfortable man in the state of Illinois. "Dad," he crouched. "Yeah, baby. What's a chairman?" 14 adults leaned in slightly. They couldn't help it. "It's a job where you sit in a room 4 times a year," James said, "and a bunch of people who are much smarter than me explain things, and then I ask questions until somebody tells me the truth. Is it a good job? It's a boring job. Is it your real job?" "No," James said. "My real job's the engines." Maya thought about that for a moment. Then she said the thing that Nathan Fielding's video caught in perfect audio, and that 4 million people would hear within 36 hours. "So you're the boss of the airplane, no sweetheart." "Then what are you the boss of?" James was quiet for a second. "The rules," he said. "I'm the boss of the rules." Nadia Okafor, the woman with the legal pad, whose full title was Independent Compliance Counsel for Crestline Holdings, and who had answered an 11-digit phone number at 9:04 that morning in an office in Wilmington, Delaware, and had been on a plane by 9:40, cleared her throat. "Mr. Holloway, I need to establish something on the record before we proceed, and I apologize for the formality. At 9:03 this morning, this office received a call from the flight deck of this aircraft. The caller relayed a request to initiate a Level 1 compliance hold. Do you understand that a Level 1 hold cannot be requested by a passenger? I do. Do you understand? It can only be requested by the chairman, the CEO, the general counsel, or the head of safety." "I wrote that list," James said. "But yes, I know you did, sir. I need you on the record anyway." "Understood. It was me. Thank you." Nadia wrote something. "Then this is now a formal proceeding, and everything said in this cabin from this moment is preserved." James looked around the cabin. He put his hands in his jacket pockets. "I want to ask 3 questions," he said. "I'm not going to ask them to catch anybody out. I'm going to ask them because I've been in board meetings for 2 years, where these exact questions get answered with a slide deck, and I want to hear them answered by people who are actually standing here." Nobody moved. "First question." He looked at Prescott. "Can a paying passenger lose a confirmed seat because somebody else on the airplane has more money?" Prescott's mouth opened. "Under policy," he said. "No, sir. Under practice." Long silence. "Yes," Prescott said. How often? Brian Prescott's shoulders came down an inch. "Maybe twice a month at this station," he said. "Not usually like this. Usually it's an upgrade shuffle, it's a companion seat, it's little stuff. Nobody screams. Nobody notices. You move somebody who won't call anybody." Second question. James didn't blink. Can a 9-year-old be separated from her only parent because a passenger with status wants a window? Number. Prescott said it immediately. No hesitation. No qualification. The voice of a man for whom this question has only one answer. "No, that one's no. That's not a gray area. That's not even close to a gray area. Then why'd you do it?" "Because there was one seat," Prescott said. "And I had a 9-minute delay, and I'd already made the first bad decision, and every bad decision after that was just, it was cheaper than going back and undoing the first one." Nadia's pen was moving very fast. Third question. James's voice changed. It got softer, and everyone in the cabin leaned in because the human ear knows the way. It knows a storm by the drop in pressure. That when a voice gets quieter, it means the thing it's saying has gotten larger. Somebody in this company wrote in a federal record that I agreed to be moved. I never said a word. I never signed a thing. Nobody asked me. He looked around. Why does that field even exist? Nobody answered, Janet Cal said quietly. The woman in navy stepped forward. Sir, the voluntary acceptance flag exists because it closes the compensation obligation. If a passenger volunteers to accept a downgrade, the carrier owes nothing. So the box that says he didn't complain, James said slowly, is the box that says we don't have to pay. Janet said, "Yes, sir." James nodded. "That's the whole thing," he said. "Right there. We built a button that turns a person's silence into their consent. And then we hired people we scare into pushing it, and then we act surprised when it gets pushed. Read the record," he said. Then he stopped. "No. Wait. Not yet." He sat down on the armrest of 1D, which is not a thing chairmen do, and rubbed his face with one hand, and the cabin watched him. And what they saw was not a chairman or a mechanic or a man with leverage, but simply a person who was very tired and was about to say something that cost him. There's something I want to say first before anybody in a suit says another word, because after that it stops being real. He looked at his hands. 2 years ago in March, my wife got on an airplane in Charlotte. The cabin went absolutely silent. Angela. She was 34. She'd had a scan on a Tuesday, and she was flying home Wednesday to tell me what it said, because she didn't want to tell me on the phone. That was Angela. Everything important had to be face to face. He paused, and the pause was not for effect. It was for survival. The pause of a man checking whether his voice is going to hold before he asks it to carry the next sentence. She was sick, and she looked sick. She had a scarf on. She'd lost about 30 pounds by then, and she had a seat in the front of that airplane because her doctor wanted her close to the door, and there was a medical note on her reservation, and a gate agent looked at her, and looked at the note, and looked at a man in a suit who wanted to sit with his colleague and moved her to row 31. Nobody breathed. She didn't fight it, James said. That was Angela. She never fought anything in her life that wasn't cancer. She sat in row 31 for 2 hours and 40 minutes, and she got off that plane, and she was gray. I met her at the curb, and I said, "What's wrong?" And she said. His voice caught once. He waited it out. The cabin waited with him. She said, "I just didn't have it in me to argue today." Dorothy Mitchell had her hand over her mouth. Simone on the galley floor had her arms around her knees. She lived 11 more months, James said. And that flight didn't kill her. I want to be clear about that because I've had 2 years to be honest about it, and I'm not going to start lying in an aisle. That flight didn't kill my wife, but it took a day from her. It took one of her last good days, and it made her feel like a piece of furniture somebody decided to rearrange. And she came home, and she told me about it. The way she told me about everything quietly and honestly. And then she went to bed. He looked up. Her father built this airline. Carolyn Ashford's hand went to her mouth. Ray Sutherland. Cal said quietly from beside him. Started with 2 turboprops and a hangar in Rockford in 1978. I was his mechanic. James was mine. Angela had the controlling interest, James said. She never wanted it. She was a music teacher. 3rd grade. She taught kids to play recorder, and she was happy doing that. And the airline was just a thing her father built that sent her a statement every quarter. He rubbed his thumb across a crease in his palm. When she died, it went to me and Maya in trust. And I sat in a room with 9 lawyers who all wanted to know what I was going to do with it, and I told them I was going to keep fixing engines, and they could keep running the company, and I'd take 1 seat on the board and 1 rule. Policy 12, Nadia said from behind her legal pad. We called it the Angela Rule for about a week, and then legal made us stop. James almost smiled. It's 4 paragraphs. It says a confirmed seat is a contract, not a suggestion. It says status doesn't move people. It says a linked child and parent don't get separated for any reason short of safety. And it says any employee who refuses an unlawful reseating instruction is protected from discipline. He looked directly at Simone Torres, sitting on the galley floor, with her knees drawn up and her face wet. That last paragraph has been in the manual for 22 months, he said. Did you know it was there? No, sir. Did anybody ever tell you? No, sir. Was it in training? It was a slide, Simone said. There was a compliance module in the spring. 41 slides. You click through them on your phone. I'm sorry. I don't remember it. Don't apologize, James said. That's my failure, not yours. I wrote a rule to protect people, and then I let it get delivered as slide 19 of 41 on a phone screen nobody reads. He turned. Cal? Yeah. Slide 19 of 41. Cal's voice was grim. I heard it. I'm going to hear it in my sleep. Mr. Holloway. It was the first thing Carolyn Ashford had said in 11 minutes. She stood up out of 2A slowly, and without any of the sounds she usually made, the rustle and the click and the small performative adjustments that normally accompanied her movements like a soundtrack. This time there was nothing. Just a woman standing up. May I ask you something? Morales shifted his weight. Nadia's pen stopped. Cal's eyes went to James. Go ahead, James said. You have a meeting in Charleston at 10 this morning. Crestline Holdings Board. Conference room. 4 items on the agenda. That's right. Item 3 is a $200 million regional acquisition. Item 3, James agreed, is Ashford Vantage Capital. The cabin made no sound at all. I've been trying to get in front of the chairman of Crestline Holdings for 2 years, Carolyn said. 2 years. I've had 4 meetings with your CFO and 3 with your general counsel. And every single one of them ended with somebody telling me the chairman doesn't take meetings. She laughed. It came out wrong, like a note played on an instrument that had been dropped. And this morning I got on an airplane and I saw a man in a work jacket sitting in my seat. It wasn't your seat, ma'am. No, she said. It wasn't. The cabin was so quiet you could hear the jet bridge settling outside the door, metal contracting in the morning air. You knew, Carolyn said. When I got on, you knew who I was. I recognized you. Yes. You knew we had a meeting in 4 hours. Yes. And you sat there. Yes. Why, and James Holloway said the thing that 11 people in first class heard perfectly, and that 3 of them would repeat for the rest of their lives, because I wanted to know what you'd do when you thought I was nobody. Carolyn Ashford put her hand on the seat back. That's not a fair test. No, James agreed. It isn't. It's the only one that works. You let it happen. I did. To your daughter, and that landed. Everybody saw it land. The way you see something heavy hit the ground. Not in slow motion, but in the sudden, absolute stillness that comes after impact. James's jaw tightened, and he took a breath through his nose, and he did not look away. That's the one, he said. That's the one that's going to keep me up. You want to hit me, ma'am, that's the spot. And you found it in about 9 seconds, which tells me everything about why you're good at your job. I wasn't trying to. You were. It's fine. You're right. James's voice was very steady, the way a bridge is steady, built to hold weight. It hopes it never has to carry. I had 11 seconds and a phone number, and I sat on my hands, and my kid watched her father get walked to the back of an airplane, and I told myself it was for the greater good. And it was. And it was also a thing I did to a 9-year-old so I could win an argument in a boardroom in 4 hours. And she's going to remember it. He looked at Maya. So there's 2 people on this airplane who did something to that kid this morning. I'm one of them. Nobody said a word. Then we're both, Carolyn started. No, ma'am. James's voice was quiet and absolutely clear. We are not both anything. And I want to be extremely clear about that because I'd rather you heard it now than from a lawyer. I did something selfish. You did something cruel. Those are not the same animal, and they don't get to shake hands and call it even. I'll answer for mine. And I'll answer for mine, Carolyn said. You'll do more than that. Meaning I don't care about your 200 million. 14 people would swear after that James's voice never rose above conversational. Item 3 is dead. It was dead the second the backpack hit the wall. And that wasn't a decision. It was just arithmetic. But that's not what I want from you. Then what do you want? James pointed at seat 2B. You threw a 9-year-old's bag down an aisle, and every adult in this cabin watched you do it. And not one of them stopped you, including me. So I don't want your money, and I don't want your apology to me. I want you to think all the way to Charleston about how easy that was. Cal stepped in then, because he'd been watching James's hands, and he'd seen the shake starting the tremor that comes not from anger, but from the effort of holding anger down. All right. Janet, Nadia, Sergeant, here's what's happening in the next 10 minutes, and I want it done clean. This aircraft doesn't move today. Not with this crew, not with this manifest, not with this record. I want 1083 canceled and recovered on the 1414 with a fresh crew and a fresh operating plan. Full refund on today's fare, every seat front to back. Hotel and meal for anyone who misses a connection. One by one, the passengers stood. All of them. Row 1 row, 2 row, 3 row, 4. 14 adults in a first-class cabin filing off an airplane past a 9-year-old girl holding a broken backpack, and every single one of them stopped at row 2 on the way out. Sorry, sweetheart. You were real brave, honey. I should have said something. I'm sorry I didn't. Your daddy's a good man. Maya said, okay, 13 times. And then to the 14th, an older man, who couldn't get any words out at all, and just put his hand on the seat back and shook his head. Maya said, it's okay. He's going to fix the zipper. Carolyn Ashford was the last one standing in the cabin. Ms. Ashford Morales said, I'm going to need to speak with you separately about the bag. Am I under arrest? No, ma'am. You're going to have a conversation with me in a room with a door, and then a lawyer is going to have a much longer one with you. Carolyn was quiet for a moment. Then she stopped at row 2, and every person still in that cabin tensed at once. Maya, she said. James moved half a step. He didn't say anything, but he moved half a step, and Carolyn saw him do it. I'm not going to apologize to you right now, Carolyn said to the girl. Because you'd have to say it's okay, and it isn't okay. And you're 9, and it's not your job to make me feel better. So I'm not going to put that on you. I'm going to do it in writing to your father when it costs me something. Maya looked up at her. You broke my zipper. I did. That was my mom's backpack. Maya's voice was steady and clear. Grandma gave it to me. It's the only one. Carolyn Ashford stopped breathing. It was hers when she was little, Maya said. And then I got it. And it's the only one. I didn't know that Carolyn said. I know Maya said. You didn't ask. Carolyn Ashford walked off that airplane without another word, and she did not look at anyone. And Sergeant Dan Morales, who had spent 26 years watching people get off airplanes, in every conceivable state of emotion, said afterward that in all that time, he had never once seen someone get smaller in 11 steps. Then it was just the crew, the executives, the sergeant, and the Holloways, and Brian Prescott, who was still standing exactly where he'd been standing for 20 minutes, holding his tablet against his chest. Cal turned toward him, and Prescott flinched. Mr. Prescott. You're relieved of duty pending investigation. You'll be paid. You'll have representation. You'll have a hearing, and you'll have the chance to say everything you want to say. Cal's voice was flat and even. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Give Rhonda your badge. Prescott took the lanyard off over his head. His hands weren't shaking anymore, which was almost worse, the stillness of a man who has stopped fighting something. He handed it over. "Mr. Calloway," Prescott said. "May I say one thing to Mr. Holloway?" Cal looked at James. James nodded. "I want to say it in front of the sergeant and the lawyer, and everybody," Prescott said. "Because I already said the true sentence once today, and I'm not going to walk it back now that it costs me." He took a breath. "I moved you because you couldn't hurt me. That's the reason. Not the system, not the delay, not the duplicate. I looked at a man with a kid and a jacket, and I decided he had nothing, and I moved him. I know," James said. "I've been doing it for 19 years. I know that too. And I've been." Prescott's voice broke completely the way a voice breaks when the thing holding it up has been removed. "I've been good at this job. That's the part I can't. I drove 40 miles in an ice storm once to bring a lady her wheelchair. I've got a wall of letters in my office. I'm not, sir. I am not a bad man." "No," James said. "You're not. Then how'd I get here?" James looked at him for a long moment. 6 seconds at a time. Prescott nodded. He wiped his face with the back of his wrist, the way men do when they've decided they're not going to do it with their hands. He walked off the airplane without looking back, and then Simone spoke from the galley floor. "Mr. Holloway, when I pulled your override log, the system showed it in a list because it groups them by station and credential." She swallowed. "Yours wasn't the only one. The cabin got very quiet." "How many at this station this month?" 19. Cal swore under his breath. 19 manual seat overrides on locked assignments at gate 12 alone, Simone said. "And one of them from 14 days ago." She looked at the screen. Same pattern. Locked seat, linked companion flag cleared. Passenger reassigned. The code on the linked flag is MNR. "What's MNR?" Morales asked. Nobody answered him. "What's MNR?" Unaccompanied minor assisted Janet Langford said. "It's a child traveling with a designated adult who isn't the parent. Grandmother usually. Foster placement sometimes. And they cleared the link," James said. "They cleared the link. So somewhere 14 days ago," James said slowly, and his voice had gone very flat. The voice of a man who is looking at something he didn't want to find. Somebody sat a kid by herself and moved the adult responsible for her and closed the compensation field at $0. And there is no chairman in this story, and no video, and nobody stopped the airplane. He set the tablet down on the seat, and for the first time all morning, James Holloway looked like a man who had been hit. "Cal, pull every station. Not just O'Hare. Every station in the whole network. 24 months. Every manual override on a locked seat with a linked minor. James, that's going to be thousands of records." "Yeah," James said. "That's what I'm afraid of." They did not fly to Charleston that day. That was the first thing, and it was the thing that mattered most to the only person on the airplane who hadn't asked for any of it. "Dad." "Yeah, baby. Are we still going? I don't know yet. You said we'd go to Mom's town. You said we'd see the church with her name on it." Maya's chin did something small and terrible, the almost trembling of a child who is trying very hard not to cry and is not going to make it. "Is it because of me? Because I got upset about the backpack and—" James made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when something hits them in the center of the chest with no warning, and he dropped to his knees in the aisle of that empty first-class cabin and took both of her hands. "No. No, sweetheart. Listen to me. Look at me. I'm looking. None of today is because of you. Not 1 second of it." He held her hand so tightly his knuckles went pale. "Today is because a bunch of grown men, including me, built something wrong and then never went back and looked at it. That's it. That's the whole thing. You didn't do anything except sit in your seat and count to 300. Cal, standing 4 feet away, cleared his throat. She's got a point, James. Cal. No, she's got a point. Cal crouched down, too, which his knees had loud opinions about. Maya, can I tell you something about your dad? Your dad is about to do a very stupid thing. He's about to spend the next 30 hours in a room with a lot of computers because he found out something bad this morning. And he's going to tell himself it's the most important thing in the world, and he's going to be right about that. He looked at James, and he's going to miss your first trip to your mother's town, and he's going to tell himself that's the price. Callan, I'm telling you, son, from a man who missed everything, that's not the price. That's just the easiest thing to pay. They took the afternoon flight with a fresh crew. Keith worked it. He'd volunteered. James asked for row 11 main cabin. Maya fell asleep over Kentucky with her head on her father's arm and the broken purple backpack in her lap. Charleston that evening was 79 degrees and smelled like river water and jasmine. They took a cab to a street lined with live oaks and stood in front of a small blue house with a wraparound porch, and Maya held her father's hand very tightly and did not go up the walk. That's where Mom lived. That's the room right there. James pointed. Second window. She had a poster of a whale on the wall. A whale? She was a strange kid. Maya laughed, and then without any transition at all started to cry, and James picked her up like she was 4 instead of 9, and stood on a sidewalk in South Carolina, holding 58 pounds of grief for about 10 minutes, while the light went orange. Dad? Yeah. That lady said I could have my seat back. She did. I didn't want it. I know it cost a lot of money, and you saved up, but I didn't want to sit there anymore. Sweetheart. James sat her down and knelt on the sidewalk. That seat wasn't the present. Then what was you getting to be somebody's kid on an airplane for 52 minutes? He said. That's what I bought. And they took it, and I'm not going to pretend they didn't. But we're standing in front of your mother's house right now. And that's the actual thing, and nobody on this earth can take that one. Maya wiped her face with the back of her wrist. Can we knock? There's people living there now. Can we knock anyway? James looked at the house. Yeah, he said. Let's knock. The audit came back at 4 in the morning 2 days later. The number over 11,000 manual overrides on locked seat assignments across the network in 24 months. 682 times a linked companion flag had been manually cleared, separating a child from the adult they were traveling with. 209 of those children were under 10. Only 14 had been compensated. The rest had been closed at 0, with the voluntary acceptance flag entered in 631 of them. James found Betty Mae Franklin's name in the records and called her himself sitting on a bench outside the small white church with Angela's name on the plaque, and Maya 15 feet away, tracing the letters with her fingers. Betty Mae was 59, a home health aide in Redford Township, Michigan. Her granddaughter Zara, 7 years old, had been in her temporary custody for 11 weeks when they boarded a flight in Detroit. Betty Mae had paid the seat lock fee because she'd read online that you should, and because Zara had never flown, and because Zara had been through 11 weeks that no 7-year-old should go through, and Betty Mae wanted her to be able to reach over and touch her grandmother's arm at any moment for the entire flight. At the gate, an agent told her there was a seating conflict. She argued. She showed her phone. A supervisor came and looked at her screen for 2 seconds and told her the same thing. And there was a line behind her, and Zara was holding onto her coat. Mr. Holloway, I need you to understand something, Betty Mae said on the phone, and her voice was careful in the way people's voices get when they've been disappointed by an institution before and have learned that the safest response is to expect nothing. I'm 59 years old, and I'm black, and I was standing at a podium at an airport arguing about a seat with a line of people behind me. You understand what I'm telling you, Ma'am? You don't get to be the person arguing, Betty Mae said. There's a version of that story where I'm the person who made a scene, and that version follows you. So I stopped. I said, fine. and they put her in row 33, and they put me in 17. And I sat in 17 for 2 hours and 11 minutes, and I could not see the top of my grandbaby's head. Did she cry? She didn't make a sound, Betty May said, and her voice broke. That's the part I can't. Mr. Holloway, she has learned not to make a sound. That's what those 11 weeks taught her. And I sat there in 17, and I thought they're teaching her again right now on this airplane. They're teaching her that when a grown-up decides something about you, you sit still, and you don't make a sound. James put his hand over his eyes and did not say anything for 11 seconds. Mrs. Franklin. Yes, somebody at that airport typed a note in your file that said, you agreed to be moved. Silence. Say that again. There's a field in our system. It says the passenger voluntarily accepted the change. Somebody checked it on your record. And when that gets checked, the company doesn't owe you anything, and the complaint closes, and nobody ever looks at it again. I never agreed to anything. I know. I said, fine. Betty May said, that's not the same word. No, ma'am, James said, it is not. At the board meeting, James put 4 demands on the table. The voluntary acceptance field removed entirely, not renamed removed. If a passenger accepts a downgrade, the company gets it in writing with a thumb on a screen, or the company owes them the money. A locked seat with a linked minor cannot be overridden by any station-level credential. It goes to Operations Command, or it doesn't happen. The cost, 11 seconds of average departure delay across the network. 11 seconds, somebody at the table said, and there was a laugh in it. 11 seconds, James said. That's the whole number. That's what we've been buying with 682 kids. The room went quiet. Third station bonus structure changed. Compliance override rate added as an equal metric alongside on-time departure percentage. Same page, same email every month. And fourth, publish every number. All of it. On the company website with James's name on it before any reporter finds it. The board pushed back. Howard Bryce, 64, 3 decades in transport, said, you understand what you're handing the plaintiff's bar. There are 681 people out there, James said. Most of them don't know there's a record. Most of them don't know there's a field with their name on it that says they agreed to something they never agreed to. If we don't publish, then everything I did on that airplane was just a rich guy getting his seat back. The vote passed 7-2. The lawsuits came. 396 settled without contesting liability. The total cost $148 million. The stock dropped 9% and took 11 months to recover. Overrides on locked assignments dropped 96%. Linked minor separations 11 and 12 months, all documented, all consented in writing, all compensated. Down from 682. Departure time impact across the network 9 seconds. Not even the 11 they estimated. Betty May Franklin fixed the cracked window in her kitchen, won the custody hearing in the spring, and put the rest in an account with Zara's name on it that she refused to touch even the year the furnace went out. Zara wore that purple backpack until 4th grade, when the shoulder strap finally gave out entirely, and Betty May found her granddaughter at the kitchen table, with a needle and a spool of heavy thread and a look of tremendous concentration. Baby, we can get you a new one. Zara didn't look up. This one's from a girl whose mom died. You can't just get a new one of that. On a Saturday morning in Rockford, James Holloway was under a Cessna 172 with grease in the creases of his knuckles and his phone face down on a rolling cart. A co-worker came in holding a newspaper with James's picture in it and asked if he was going to talk to the 6 people with cameras out front. James didn't come out from under the cowling. The co-worker asked what he was doing under a Cessna when he could own the whole shop. Because that thing's going to have a family in it Tuesday, James said, and I'd like it to come back. At an airport gate 2 years later, A gate agent looked at a locked seat assignment on her screen, then at a grandmother holding a small child's hand in the boarding line, then at the flashing override prompt waiting for her credentials. She closed the prompt without touching it. The grandmother never knew. Nobody wrote an article. No airplane stopped. A 7-year-old boarded holding her grandmother's hand, sat in the seat that was always hers, and the flight departed on time 11 seconds late. If you stand for justice, dignity, and respect, hit subscribe and join our channel. Together, we rise.